All right. We are picking up in our study of 2 Samuel. Remember that in chapter 8, it was kind of we covered it pretty quickly, but it was a chapter that was primarily focused on some of David's military successes throughout being a king of Israel. And we noticed that the territory expands basically in all directions. David's able to expand to the east when it concerned a nation like Moab, and as we'll see a little bit later on, the nation of Ammon. He's able to further take on the Philistines to the west. He deals with the nation of Syria to the north. And basically the culminating point is that by the end of David's reign, Israel is at its height in terms of its military power, and slowly that will begin to wear away from Solomon onward. Now, I do want to clarify something. I think last week, 2 Samuel chapter 8, verse 18, I said the Cherethites were a reference to the Babylonians. I was thinking of the Chaldeans. The Cherethites and the Pelethites were supposedly soldiers from Philistia who actually served in David's army. So they didn't come from Babylon to the east. They actually came from, they were soldiers from Philistia. Now in chapter 9, again, keep in mind that this book is not necessarily written in chronological order. The events of chapter 9 probably happened somewhere in between the events of chapter 8. But in chapter 9, we return back to David's relationship with the house of Saul. Saul's not there anymore, but still you see David basically honoring the house of Saul. And as we'll note, David still feels a very compassionate loyalty to his friend Jonathan, who obviously at this point has died. But I've sort of entitled this chapter, again, David's kindness to the house of Saul, basically because this is the primary focus in this passage. Again, Saul had been an enemy of David, but as we've seen on multiple occasions, David always had a great response to his enemies, at least in terms of how he dealt with them. And in this particular passage, David is going to try to help out one of Saul's sons, whose name was Mephibosheth. The Bible says in Ephesians chapter 4, verse 32, to be kind to one another. In fact, Ephesians 4, verse 32, the Apostle Paul says, and this is from the ESV, be kind to one another, tender-hearted, forgiving one another as God in Christ forgave you. People of God are expected to be kind. And as Jesus pointed out in Matthew chapter 5, the kindness goes not just to the people that we like, but also towards our enemies. That's what separates us as Christians from those of the world. It's easy to be kind to those that are kind to us, but it's very hard to be kind to those that are evil, that we don't like. And David, you can tie that verse in, that verse really ties in. A good example of Ephesians 4, verse 32 is certainly an illustration that is certainly in 2 Samuel chapter 9. Because remember that God had already dealt with David when it came to the carrying of the Ark of the Covenant. Right? God's forgiven him. God's going to forgive him in another instance in a couple of weeks in 2 Samuel 11. But David is one who shows kindness in a lot of ways because of the kindness that God has shown him. So let's begin 2 Samuel chapter 9, and let's begin with verse 1. And David said, is there yet any that is left of the house of Saul, that I may show him kindness for Jonathan's sake? Now, we, again, don't know the exact time, at least within David's reign, when this happens. Most seem to think that this was several years after when David had first taken over as king, mainly because Mephibosheth, according to verses 11 and 12, already had a son. And we hadn't read about Mephibosheth yet, but that's who's going to be the focus here. But David is looking to show kindness to the house of Saul. Now, we've talked about this before, but a lot of times what was, we could say, expected of a king was that if a new king took over, right, a new dynasty, a king from a different family took over, sometimes the new king would actually kill off the old family, right, because he didn't want any opponents. A lot of kings have done that throughout history. An example of this would be in 2 Kings chapter 10, where in the northern kingdom of Israel, a new dynasty under the new king Jehu, he went and killed off all of Ahab's family, basically to consolidate, to make sure that his reign as king was protected. That was not that was sort of expected. That happened a good bit, especially in the northern kingdom of Israel, where you had a lot of frequent changes. David, on the other hand, was not of that disposition. In fact, he actually, in this verse, wants to show kindness to the house of his former rival. Now notice he does this for whose sake? For Jonathan. And we want to turn back in our Bibles to 1 Samuel chapter 20. And in 1 Samuel chapter 20, we have one of the discussions between David and Jonathan. You know, they met and talked on several occasions in the book of 1 Samuel. But notice what Jonathan, or not necessarily requires, but asks of David. And I'll get Dad, if he would, to read for us verses 14 through 17. 1 Samuel 20, verses 14 through 17.
Thou shalt not only while yet I live show me the kindness of the Lord, that I die not, but also thou shalt not cut off thy kindness from my house forever. No, not when the Lord hath cut off the enemies of David, every one from the face of the earth. So Jonathan made a covenant with the house of David, saying, Let the Lord even require it at the hand of David's enemies. And Jonathan caused David to swear again, because he loved him, for he loved him as he loved his own soul.
All right. Notice again what Jonathan wants from David. Right? Thou shalt not cut off thy kindness from my house forever. That was in my Bible, you know, not the author, but a commentator has a heading there, Jonathan's covenant with David. And a covenant is a promise. And again, verse 16, they make that covenant. Well, Jonathan has died, and David now has the choice again about what to do about Saul's house. But notice that he's going to honor this covenant, right? Jonathan wanted to make sure that David would not cut off kindness from his house. That would have been a reference to the house of to the house of Jonathan, the house of Saul. And in 2 Samuel chapter 9, we see the fulfillment of that. We see David honoring and upholding that covenant. Now I want you to notice also in verse 5, or in verse 15 of 1 Samuel 20, that second phrase, No, not when the Lord hath cut off the enemies of David, every one from the face of the earth. Now I want you to keep that passage in mind, and now turn over to 2 Samuel chapter 7 and read verse 1. This is a chapter that we talked about a few weeks ago. In 2 Samuel chapter 7, verse 1, And it came to pass when the king sat in his house, and the Lord had given him rest round about from all his enemies. Remember that this chapter, they're talking about David wanting to build the temple, but you have that same timestamp there, right? Jonathan in 1 Samuel 20, verse 15, mentions about when God would cut off the enemies of David. Well, in 2 Samuel verse 7, says there that God had given David rest from all his enemies. So perhaps the events of chapter 9 fit maybe not long after David tries to, or pleads with God to build the temple. And so as one writer sort of pointed out here, you go from David asking God, what can I do for you, to now in 2 Samuel chapter 9, where David's asking, what can I do to help others? So it's kind of a nice transition there, showing David's selflessness in a sense, not thinking about himself as a king, but thinking about what he can do for God and also what he can do for others now as the king. And that's what he's doing here in 2 Samuel chapter 9, verse 1. So David is wanting to know, who can I help? Verse 2 of 2 Samuel chapter 9. Now there was of the house of Saul a servant, whose name was Ziba. And when they had called him unto David, the king said unto him, Are you Ziba? And he said, Thy servant is he. And the king said, Is there not yet any of the house of Saul, that I may show the kindness of God unto him? And Ziba said unto the king, Jonathan hath yet a son, which is lame on his feet. And this would then be Saul's grandson, but it would be the son of Jonathan. Now, remember, back in 2 Samuel chapter 4, and I believe it was 2 Samuel chapter 4 and verse 4. When Mephibosheth was going to be killed, right? Remember, we talked about that chapter. Verse 4 says that Jonathan, Saul's son, had a son that was lame of his feet. He was 5 years old when the tidings came of Saul and Jonathan out of Jezreel. So this happens when Saul and Jonathan had died. His nurse took him up and fled, and it came to pass, as she made haste to flee, that he fell and became lame, and his name was Mephibosheth. And so that's sort of how this son of Jonathan had become lame. Remember that when Saul and Jonathan died, the Philistines had actually taken over part of that territory. And so the nurse of Jonathan's son, in order to flee from the Philistine army approaching, picks up Mephibosheth, to carry him away to get out of there before a lot of bad things could happen. She drops him, or she falls, and he becomes lame on his feet. And so that's how he's in that condition. A lot of times in the Bible, and a lot of times in the New Testament, when Jesus heals somebody, we're just told that he was lame for 18 years, or he was blind from the beginning of birth. This is actually one of the unique instances where we do know why someone had become crippled. But this is Jonathan's son. Notice that again, that David is communicating with a former servant of Saul. Again, if David had wanted to kill off the house of Saul, Ziba probably would have been killed as well, being a servant of Saul. But David chose not to do that, and that benefits him now because he is able to show to Jonathan's house David's kindness. All right, verse 4. And the king said unto him, Where is he? And Ziba said unto the king, Behold, he is in the house of Machir, the son of Ammiel in Lodabar. And then King David sent and fetched him out of the house of Machir, the son of Ammiel from Lodabar. Now, when you pay attention to what's going on here in verses 4 and 5, there are a couple things that we note that we can sort of infer in these verses. One, Mephibosheth is not really living in a royal type of lifestyle. He's the grandson of the former king. He's really not living in any type of royalty, because you notice in verse 4 that he is living in the house of another man. He lives in the house of Machir, the son of Ammiel in Lodabar. Remember that Mephibosheth's uncle, Ishbosheth, had kind of set up a rival kingdom, but that had already collapsed because Israel and Judah were united when David became the king over both. But Mephibosheth, on the other hand, is not living in any type of royalty, any type of a great estate. He's actually living in the house of another man. And that's sort of shows that his status is kind of fallen off. Keep in mind again that he is also lame on his feet. We know from in the New Testament and really in the Old Testament, if you don't have the capacity to work, if you can't walk, you're at the mercy of others. So he's in a very low position. But you also notice too that this son of Jonathan is basically out in hiding, right? Because, David doesn't know where he's at. David doesn't even know if there's a son left, or if there's anybody left that is an offspring of Jonathan. Perhaps he is hiding because he's afraid of what David might do to him. But this passage is again focused on David showing kindness and upholding the covenant that he made to Jonathan. And so now, verse 6, now when Mephibosheth, the son of Jonathan, the son of Saul, was come unto David, he fell on his face and did reverence. And David said, Mephibosheth. And he answered, Behold thy servant. And David said unto him, Fear not, for I will surely show thee kindness for Jonathan thy father's sake, and will restore thee all the land of Saul thy father, and thou shalt eat bread at my table continually. And he bowed himself and said, What is thy servant, that thou shouldest look upon such a dead dog as I am? Now, you kind of get the sense in verse 6 that perhaps Mephibosheth is a little bit concerned about what's going on here. People that come from royalty, or people that come from sort of that come from an elite family, a lot of times there's a whole level of respect that they expect to be shown, right? Mephibosheth doesn't approach David, as the grandson of the former king. He doesn't approach him in envy or anything like that. But he approaches David as one of what David's servants would have done. He falls on his face, he did reverence. And David said, Mephibosheth, and he answered, Behold thy servant. And David in verse 7 perhaps notes that Mephibosheth is not necessarily sure what's going on here, right? David said unto him, Fear not. Typically you don't have to give that address to not be afraid if you're dealing with somebody who's not afraid. So Mephibosheth, perhaps he's thinking about what the worst case scenario is here, is afraid to go before David. But David just reassures him that there is no need to be afraid. And of course he does this for the reason that we saw in 1 Samuel 20. I will show thee kindness for Jonathan thy father's sake. Now notice what he promises here. Notice what David promises here. And will restore thee all the land of Saul thy father, and thou shalt eat bread at my table continually. So first of all, David promises Mephibosheth that he would be restored basically to the inheritance that he would receive from the house of Saul. He would receive that land. Now this, of course, says a whole lot about David, because on other instances we know that kings could often be greedy, not just for money, but also greedy for land. What king of Israel had his wife murder someone for his land? Ahab and Jezebel, right? Remember that Ahab went to go to Naboth, right? Yeah, Naboth. I was thinking of Nabal and Naboth. Nabal is 1 Samuel 25. Naboth, remember, had a vineyard that King Ahab looked at and he desired it. But because it was part of Naboth's inheritance, it still belonged to the house of, it belonged to Naboth and his household. But that didn't mean that Ahab didn't want it then, all of a sudden. So you remember what Ahab did when he was told that Naboth would not give his vineyard. You remember what Ahab then did. Yeah, he went to bed and cried about it, right? And Jezebel came in there. She's trying to figure out what was going on with Ahab. And Jezebel figures out that Ahab wanted a vineyard, and Naboth wouldn't give it to him. And so Jezebel has Naboth killed, and Ahab got the vineyard. That was certainly a wicked king of Israel. That's a king that did not have a piece of land, that did basically whatever was necessary to obtain that land. He was an evil king. I think that's a good contrast to what David is doing here in verse 7. David basically possesses this land already. He has it at its disposal. He is the one that can determine whether or not it can be given out to whoever he wants to do that. But David was a man of kindness, unlike Ahab and unlike Jezebel. And David is willing to give this land back to Mephibosheth because it was essentially his inheritance from his grandfather's house. So that's a good contrast there, I think, in verse 7. David versus Ahab. Because kings could often be very greedy for land, but David was a man, again, it's another way that he showed kindness to the house of Saul, restoring the land back to Mephibosheth. Notice also, verse 7, that David makes the promise that thou shalt eat bread at my table continually. And what that indicates is that Mephibosheth would have fellowship with the king. He would be able to eat with David. That shows a sign of partnership. It shows a sign of favorability. And it shows that Mephibosheth, who we keep in mind is lame on his feet, would be taken care of by the house of David. In the Bible, when you see that phrase, to eat bread at my table, it shows a sign of fellowship, and it shows a sign of taking care of the needs of an individual. In the Old Testament, it was said that Jezebel allowed the prophets of Baal to eat bread at her table, which means that she was in alliance with which means that she was allied with the prophets of Baal, because she was an idolatrous woman. I think that's also sort of an interesting connection there when you think about the Lord's Supper. Because the bread with the Lord's Supper obviously represents the body of Christ, but it also represents fellowship among Christians, does it not? It's in part why we partake of the bread, not just to remember Christ's death, but if you think about in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, when they had corrupted the Lord's Supper, there were those that had plenty, there were those that did not have enough, and Paul's point sort of in that passage was, you're all on the same level, right? You're all Christians. You all should be partaking of the same. The idea of fellowship is sort of the idea of eating bread at my table continually. And that's sort of an interesting connection, but it also shows that David's not just giving Mephibosheth land and saying that's the end of it, but David's making the promise to Mephibosheth that you will always be taken care of by my family, or at least by me. And so David's kindness is shown here in both of those ways. And Mephibosheth's only response there in verse 8 is simply, "What is thy servant that thou shouldest look upon such a dead dog as I am?" Sort of the idea that Mephibosheth didn't think he was worthy of the gifts of the king, or the grace and mercy that's being bestowed upon him. Sort of a good representation about our relationship with God, right? God, if we're faithful to Him, obviously promises us not necessarily physical prosperity, but certainly, of course, spiritual prosperity, spiritual fellowship in the church. And our reaction to that should sort of be like what Mephibosheth's reaction is. Why do we deserve this, God? What are we? What are we in Thy sight? Sort of as David said, as Brother Wayne pointed out, Psalm chapter 8. What is man that Thou art mindful of him? was David's response to the kindness of God in response to the totality or all of creation? Well, Mephibosheth's response to David's kindness represents what our response should be to the kindness of God. We haven't done anything to earn it. We shouldn't look at it as something that we are entitled to, but it's a mindset that, God, we don't deserve your kindness. We're not very much in the grand scheme of things. And naturally, Mephibosheth is very appreciative. And if we have Mephibosheth's mindset towards the blessings of God, then we're going to have the same appreciation for what God has done for us. Are there any comments that you'd like to add on to what we've said in verses 1 through 8?
You stressed this, but again, the importance of keeping your word. If you say you'll do something, and as you noted, it had been years since the promise had been made, but David never forgot his promise. And in remembering what he had promised, or the covenant that had been made, I'm going to do my part to do what I said. In a day, where a lot of people just say things that really don't either mean, or sometimes we forget. Just again, the importance that God keeps his word, David kept his word, and we need to do our utmost. If we say it, we need to try to do it.
Yeah, he wasn't giving Jonathan lip service when he made that covenant. Because it could have easily been the case where if that's a covenant made between Jonathan and David, Jonathan's dead, nobody would know if David kept it or not. But David was indeed a man of his word. Now we'll say in verse 4, the final thing on this section, the house of Machir. David's actions here are actually going to pay off later on when Absalom tries to rebel against David, because it's going to be this same house of Machir that is actually going to go out to David and provide David and his men provisions when the civil war between David and Absalom is taking place. So kindness can go a lot further than the immediate benefit. It can have a lasting benefit to it. And I know, if you think about certain examples in your life, you think about kindness that is shown, it has more than an immediate response. It can kind of have a long-lasting response. I know as a teacher sometimes, if you, especially with it being a first-year teaching, sometimes you make tests a little bit harder than perhaps what they should be. Sometimes I take into consideration there, if I maybe curve or let them do extra work to get extra points back. That kindness helps them immediately, but sometimes as a teacher, that kindness actually lasts towards the end of the semester because your students will have maybe a little bit of a greater level of respect for you, because you're not just trying to be hard, but you're also taking into consideration, you're concerned about their grades in your class. That's an example that I think about a lot, about the long-lasting impact of kindness. Certainly, you think about when you've helped out somebody, a lot of times later on in life that paid great dividends for you. Let's look at verses 9 through 13. We can pick up with this next week if we need to. We probably will. All right, so verse 9, the king called to Ziba, Saul's servant, and said unto him, I have given unto thy master's son all that pertained to Saul and to all his house. Thou therefore and thy sons and thy servants shall till the land for him, and thou shalt bring in the fruits, that thy master's son may have food to eat. But Mephibosheth, thy master's son, shall eat bread always at my table. Now Ziba had 15 sons and 20 servants. So and again, we saw those two things granted in verse 7. Now in addition to that, David is also basically promising to Mephibosheth that he will have servants to help provide food for him and for his family, right? And that's in the form of Ziba. Instead of David claiming Ziba to be his servant, he commands Ziba basically to be the servant for Mephibosheth. As he says in verse 10, Ziba and his son's responsibility and his servant's responsibility is to till the land for him, and thou shalt bring in the fruits, that thy master's son may have food to eat. This is a type of work that Mephibosheth obviously could not do for himself because he is not able to walk. You might want to put in your Bibles here Leviticus chapter 25, verse 46. Leviticus chapter 25, verse 46. Because according to the Old Testament, and this part of Leviticus is dealing with servants, the relationship with servants to the Israelites. In Leviticus chapter 25, verse 46, Moses writes, or inspired obviously, but the writer states, "And ye shall take them," talking about servants, "as an inheritance for your children after you, to inherit them for a possession. They shall be your bondmen forever. But over your brethren, the children of Israel, ye shall not rule one over another with vigor," or with rigor. And the point being is that servants would continue to, whenever the father died, the servants would then work for the son, and it would keep working down that way. The servant's family would continue to work for that lineage. And that's what David is actually recognizing here in verse 10, is that principle from Leviticus 25, verse 46, that Ziba and his sons, since they were supposed to be servants to Saul, that continued all the way down through Saul's house. So that's why Ziba and his sons and Ziba's servants are expected to continue to work for the house of Saul to help out Mephibosheth. And then verse 11, we'll read this, we'll pick up with this next week. "Then said Ziba unto the king, According to all that my lord the king hath commanded his servant, so shall thy servant do. As for Mephibosheth, said the king, he shall eat at my table as one of the king's sons. And Mephibosheth had a young son whose name was Micah, and all that dwelt in the house of Ziba were servants unto Mephibosheth. So Mephibosheth dwelt in Jerusalem, for he did eat continually at the king's table, and was lame on both his feet." So he's taken care of through the servants. He's also taken care of in the sense that he has a right to eat at the king's table. And this kindness will pay off basically when we get to 2 Samuel 16, because there are going to be some that try to bring up that David had taken the throne violently away from the house of Saul. But David's innocence is proven for a lot of reasons, including in chapter 9, because of David's kindness to the house of Saul. But we're going to go ahead and stop here this morning because we're out of time. We'll pick up, there'll probably be a couple things that I'll point out in chapter 9, but then we'll pick up in 2 Samuel chapter 10, Lord willing, next Sunday. But thank you for your time, and thank you for your attention this morning.